People who found out they were cut from a will. What's the story? My sister convinced our parents I was a financial disaster while I was quietly paying their mortgage for 3 years. I found out I'd been written out of my parents' will while sitting in a lawyer's office, watching my sister Halsey fake tears about having to handle everything alone after Dad's funeral. She'd been building a case against me for years, painting me as the irresponsible sibling who couldn't be trusted with money. I'd been secretly covering their $2,800 mortgage payment every month since 2021. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how I became the ghost daughter who kept everything running while my sister got all the credit for existing. It started when Dad had his first heart attack 3 years ago. Nothing dramatic, just a mild episode that landed him in the hospital for a week. Halsey flew in from Portland, spent 2 days crying in the hallway, posted about it on Instagram, and flew home to her marketing job and her perfect townhouse. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who learned his medication schedule. I was the one who realized their savings had evaporated faster than morning fog. Dad's insurance covered the hospital stay, but not the 3 months of reduced hours at his accounting firm while he recovered. Mom's part-time job at the library barely covered groceries. I found the stack of overdue mortgage notices tucked under a coffee mug in their kitchen, Dad's handwriting getting shakier with each attempt to calculate payment plans they couldn't afford. I started making the deposits. Direct transfer every month, $2,800, like clockwork. Never mentioned it, never expected thanks, just handled it the way I'd been handling things for them my entire adult life. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly. Because that's what I do. I'm the daughter who appears when the dishwasher breaks, when their internet goes down, when they need someone to wait for the cable guy. I'm the one who notices Mom's prescription needs refilling before she does, who remembers Dad's cardiologist appointments, who restocks their pantry when they pretend they're not struggling to reach the high shelves anymore. Halsey sends flowers for birthdays. I pay for groceries. Halsey calls every Sunday for 20 minutes. I text every day and stop by twice a week. Halsey gets praised for being such a devoted daughter because she remembers to send Mother's Day cards. I get thanked for always being around like I'm furniture that occasionally becomes useful. The mortgage payments were just another item on my invisible to-do list. Another thing that needed handling. Dad never asked where the money came from. Maybe he assumed it was some kind of automatic assistance program, or maybe he just decided not to look that particular gift horse in the mouth. Mom mentioned once that their bank account seemed more stable lately, but I just nodded and changed the subject. Meanwhile, Halsey's Sunday phone calls became performance art. She'd update them on her promotion, her new car, her weekend trips to wine country. She'd mention how responsible she was being with her 401k, how proud they must be that she'd learned to manage money so well. I'd sit there during family dinners, listening to Dad beam about Halsey's financial discipline while I mentally calculated how much I'd transferred to keep their house out of foreclosure. Listening to Mom worry about whether your sister will ever learn to handle money like Halsey does, while Halsey's idea of financial responsibility was splitting an Uber. The thing about being taken for granted is that it happens gradually, then suddenly. First you're helping out during a crisis, then you're helping out during the recovery, then you're just helping out, period. And everyone forgets there was ever a time when you weren't. Dad's medications appeared when he needed them, bills got paid on time, groceries materialized, the house stayed warm because the mortgage stayed current, Halsey got credit for caring because she called to check if they were okay, I got assumptions that I'd always be available because I always had been. And through it all, Halsey remained the golden child who'd made something of herself, while I remained the dependable one who'd never quite figured things out. The one with the stable job somehow became the financially irresponsible one. The one paying their bills became the one they worried about. I should have seen it coming. The shift started small, the way poison works, one drop at a time until suddenly you're wondering why everything tastes bitter. Mom began asking weird questions during my routine grocery runs, casual observations that felt like interrogations wrapped in maternal concern. She'd eye the organic vegetables I'd put in their cart and mention how expensive everything was getting, how people needed to be more careful with money these days. When I bought Dad his favorite cookies, the ones that cost $3 more, but were the only brand his medication-altered taste buds could tolerate, she'd sigh about impulse purchases. I was standing in their kitchen, having just transferred another $2,800 to keep their house, listening to lectures about fiscal responsibility triggered by a box of cookies. Dad started making comments, too. Observations about my coffee habit when he saw the Starbucks cup in my car, despite the fact that it was my one daily indulgence and cost less than the blood pressure medication I'd picked up for him that morning. He'd shake his head with this disappointed father expression and mention articles he'd read about how small purchases add up, how his generation knew the value of $1, this from a man whose mortgage I'd been paying for 18 months. The comments multiplied like bacteria. Suddenly, every visible purchase became evidence of my financial recklessness. The new work shoes I needed because the old ones had holes became proof I didn't understand priorities. I started hiding purchases, leaving shopping bags in my car, removing price tags before bringing anything into their house, moving like a teenager smuggling contraband, except the contraband was basic adult necessities, and the authority figures were people whose electricity bill I'd covered the week before. The grocery store confrontation was when I understood the scope of her campaign. I was checking out with their weekly supplies, the usual routine of filling their fridge and pantry while grabbing a few things for myself. Dad was with me because Mom had asked him to keep an eye on things, though I didn't understand what needed watching. As the cashier rang up their items, Dad noticed the total climbing. He started making disapproving sounds. small huffs of surprise at the cost of produce, muttered complaints about inflation. When my personal items came through, a bottle of wine for a friend's birthday, face wash, a magazine, his disapproval crystallized into something sharper. The lecture in the parking lot felt surreal. Dad explaining how I needed to be more mindful about mixing my purchases with theirs, how it created confusion about who was paying for what, how Halsey had mentioned she was concerned about my spending habits, and maybe she had a point. Halsey had been concerned. Halsey, who hadn't bought them groceries in 3 years, was concerned about my grocery bills. I drove home in stunned silence, replaying every recent interaction through this new lens. The way Mom had started double-checking receipts when I paid for their prescriptions. The way Dad had begun questioning whether they really needed the premium health insurance I'd researched and recommended. The way both of them had started treating my help like a favor they needed to monitor rather than support they'd come to depend on. Meanwhile, Halsey's Sunday phone calls had evolved into financial advice sessions. Mom would mention Halsey's recommendations about cutting unnecessary expenses, Halsey's wisdom about distinguishing needs from wants, Halsey's concern that some people in the family might be living beyond their means. Some people, never me by name, just some hypothetical family member who clearly couldn't manage an adult budget responsibly. I was being gaslit by my own good intentions, watching my years of invisible support get transformed into evidence against me. The mortgage payments that kept them housed became proof I was desperate. The grocery deliveries became proof I was impulsive. The medication pickups became proof I was enabling their dependence. And through it all, Halsey remained the responsible daughter calling from Portland with sage advice about financial discipline, while I became the problem child who needed intervention. The ghost daughter was finally visible, but only as a cautionary tale about fiscal irresponsibility. Halsey's documentation project began in earnest after Dad's second cardiac episode. What I initially mistook for increased family involvement was actually investigative journalism disguised as sisterly concern. She started extending her weekend visits, arriving Friday nights instead of Saturday mornings, staying through Monday to really spend quality time with Mom and Dad. During these extended stays, she appointed herself the family's unofficial auditor, cataloging my every transaction like evidence for a case I didn't know was being built against me. The Amazon deliveries became her smoking gun. Every package that arrived during her visits got photographed, documented, analyzed for signs of compulsive spending. The protein powder I ordered for Dad after his doctor recommended increasing his intake became unnecessary supplements. The ergonomic cushions for Mom's arthritis became frivolous comfort items. The bulk toilet paper and cleaning supplies I ordered to save myself weekly trips became hoarding behavior. Halsey had discovered the modern equivalent of going through someone's trash, except she was doing it with my purchasing history and presenting her findings as loving concern. She started positioning herself as the family's financial watchdog during their Sunday calls, which I only learned about through increasingly pointed conversations. Dad would mention that Halsey had noticed my car payment seemed high for someone in my income bracket. Mom would casually bring up Halsey's observation that I seemed to be ordering takeout frequently, based on the delivery bags she'd seen in my trash during her visits. My trash. She was literally going through my garbage to build a case about my spending habits. The credit monitoring became another weapon in her arsenal. Halsey had somehow convinced our parents to add her as an authorized user on one of their credit cards, ostensibly to help with emergency expenses during her visits. What this really gave her was access to their account statements, including the payments I'd been making directly to their mortgage company. But Halsey didn't present these payments as generosity. She spun them as evidence of my financial desperation. Why else would someone my age be making irregular large payments to our parents' accounts? Clearly, I was borrowing money from them. Obviously, I was in some kind of debt spiral that required constant bailouts from Mom and Dad's limited retirement funds. My mortgage payments became proof of my financial irresponsibility rather than evidence of my stability. Halsey convinced them that responsible children don't need to constantly transfer money to their parents. They have their own houses to worry about, their own retirement funds to build. Only someone living paycheck to paycheck would be shuffling money around like that. She painted my support as chaos rather than care, desperation rather than devotion. The intervention arrived disguised as a family dinner. Halsey had flown in specially for the occasion, armed with printouts and genuine tears about her concerns for her little sister's financial future. She'd prepared a presentation that would have impressed her marketing clients, complete with charts tracking my spending patterns and graphs showing the correlation between my erratic payments to their accounts and my obvious financial distress. I sat through an hour-long seminar about budgeting basics and debt management, delivered by people whose utilities I'd been covering for 2 years. Halsey had somehow obtained copies of my bank statements, probably from mail she'd intercepted during her extended stays, and highlighted every transaction that could be interpreted as excessive or impulsive. The wine I'd bought for my friend's birthday became evidence of alcohol dependency. The massage I'd gotten after throwing out my back moving their furniture became proof of spa addiction. The clothing replacements after I'd ruined my work wardrobe helping them clean out their flooded basement became a shopping compulsion. These people who'd raised me, who'd supposedly known me for 32 years, accepted Halsey's narrative over the evidence of their own lived experience. They couldn't see that their mysteriously stable finances coincided exactly with my presence in their lives. They couldn't connect the dots between my erratic transfers and their ability to stay current on bills. Or maybe they could see it. But Halsey's version was more comfortable. It's easier to believe your successful daughter is helping your struggling daughter than to acknowledge that your struggling daughter has been propping up your entire financial structure. Mom started hiding their mail during my visits, claiming it was to reduce my stress about their finances. Dad began insisting on reviewing receipts before I paid for their groceries, worried that I was confusing their needs with my wants. They implemented a new policy requiring advance approval for any purchases over $50, ostensibly to help me develop better spending habits. I was being managed like a teenager with a problem credit card by people whose mortgage I was paying like a responsible adult. Halsey started mentioning her concerns to their neighbors, their friends from church, anyone who would listen to her worry about her sister's apparent financial troubles. Soon I was fielding concerned calls from family friends who'd heard I was having money problems, offering assistance I didn't need for crises I wasn't experiencing. My reputation in their community transformed from devoted daughter to financial disaster being enabled by aging parents too kind to set boundaries. The final humiliation was discovering that Halsey had set up a family group chat specifically to discuss my spending patterns. Mom, Dad, and Halsey exchanged screenshots of my purchases, analyzed my banking activity, and developed strategies for addressing my money management issues. They were holding regular family meetings about my finances, without including the family member whose finances they were discussing. I found out about the group chat when Dad accidentally sent me a message meant for Halsey, asking whether my recent car repair bill was something they should be concerned about, or just another example of my poor planning. They were treating me like a case study in financial irresponsibility, while I was quietly ensuring they had a roof over their heads. The invisible daughter had finally become visible, but only as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be appreciated. Halsey had successfully transformed 3 years of sacrifice into evidence of incompetence, rewriting my story until even I began to question whether my support had been helping or hurting. The funeral arrangements were handled exactly as you'd expect. Halsey orchestrated the ceremony while I managed everything that actually mattered. She picked flowers and wrote the obituary. I coordinated with the mortuary, organized the meal service, and made sure Dad's medications were properly disposed of so Mom wouldn't accidentally take them in her grief-induced fog. Halsey delivered a beautiful eulogy about Dad's impact on her life. I spent the service calculating how many months Mom could afford the house payments on her library income alone, which is to say none. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Halsey insisted we all needed to be there together, family unity during difficult times and all that. She'd flown back to Portland after the funeral, but returned specifically for this appointment, treating it like a formality that required her professional presence. I assumed we were there to discuss the logistics of Dad's small life insurance policy and maybe figure out what to do with his coin collection. These weren't wealthy people. The most valuable thing they owned was a house I'd been keeping them from losing for 3 years. Attorney Michael Brennan had been handling my parents' legal affairs since before I was born. He knew me as the daughter who'd driven them to appointments, who'd helped them understand their Medicare options, who'd been present for every significant medical and financial decision of the past decade, which made his expression when we entered his office particularly confusing. The reading began with standard legal language about sound mind and body, the kind of formalities that make death feel like a business transaction. Then came the specifics that made my chest tighten with each word. Everything went to Halsey, the house, the remaining bank accounts, Dad's retirement fund, even Mom's car, everything except a few personal items. His watch, some books, that were designated for me with the careful precision of someone distributing participation trophies. But it was the reasoning that shattered something fundamental in my understanding of our family dynamic. According to the will, updated just 8 months ago, I was considered financially unstable and unable to handle inheritance responsibly. The document cited concerns about my debt management, my impulsive spending patterns, and my tendency to make poor financial decisions that would jeopardize any assets left in my care. Mr. Brennan's reading voice remained professionally neutral as he detailed my parents' worries about my gambling problems. I'd never placed a bet in my life beyond office March Madness brackets. He continued with their concerns about my irregular income and my pattern of borrowing money from them to cover basic expenses. Their fear that leaving me significant assets would only enable my destructive financial habits rather than providing the security they intended. I sat there listening to my father's final assessment of my character, delivered in legal terminology that made my years of sacrifice sound like evidence of criminal irresponsibility. According to this document, I was a financial burden who'd spent years taking advantage of their generosity, rather than a daughter who'd quietly kept them afloat. Halsey was crying. She reached for my hand and whispered about how sorry she was, how she'd tried to convince them I was more responsible than they believed, how she'd fought for me to receive equal treatment. The lies came so naturally to her that I almost believed them myself. Mr. Brennan explained that the will included a provision for my rehabilitation if I could demonstrate sustained financial responsibility for 2 years, including regular employment and debt elimination. Halsey was encouraged to consider sharing some portion of the inheritance. I was essentially being put on probation for my own family's estate, with my sister as the parole officer. The meeting concluded with Halsey receiving keys, account numbers, and immediate access to everything our parents had built over 4 decades of marriage. I received a handshake and a business card for a financial counseling service that Mr. Brennan thought might help me get back on track. Walking to our cars afterward, Halsey maintained her performance of reluctant responsibility. She talked about the burden of managing everything alone, how she'd never wanted this kind of decision-making power, how she hoped we could work together to honor our parents' wishes while still supporting each other as sisters. I listened to her lie with the same professional competence she probably used in marketing presentations, watching her transform inheritance theft into sisterly sacrifice. She was prepared to graciously allow me to prove my worthiness over the next 2 years, during which she'd have complete control over assets I'd spent 3 years protecting. That evening, alone in my apartment for the first time since Dad's heart attack, I started putting pieces together that I'd been too exhausted and grief-stricken to see clearly. I pulled bank statements, mortgage records, utility payments, 3 years of financial documentation that told a completely different story than the one my parents had believed when they updated their will. Every transfer I'd made to keep their house, every bill I'd covered, every crisis I'd quietly resolved was there in black and white. Then I called Mom to ask some direct questions about the will process. She was still fragile, still processing Dad's death, but she was also relieved to talk about practical matters instead of emotions. The timeline she described was illuminating. Halsey had initiated conversations about estate planning during her extended visit last spring. Halsey had recommended Mr. Brennan update their documents to reflect current family circumstances. Halsey had helped them compile their concerns about my financial situation into language appropriate for legal documentation. Halsey had essentially ghostwritten my own disinheritance. But the most devastating revelation came when Mom mentioned the mortgage payments. She'd always wondered where that money came from, she said. Dad had explained it as some kind of assistance program for seniors, maybe something through his old employer or their church. When she'd asked directly, he'd gotten vague and changed the subject. They'd never connected my regular transfers to their mysteriously stable finances. Dad had apparently convinced himself that the money was coming from some external source, possibly because accepting that level of support from me would have complicated the narrative Halsey was building about my irresponsibility. Or maybe he'd known exactly where the money came from and chosen to ignore it because acknowledging my support would have undermined their justification for cutting me out of their will. The possibility that they'd knowingly accepted my financial help while simultaneously documenting my financial incompetence was almost worse than discovering they'd been fooled by Halsey's manipulation. I spent the rest of that week calculating exactly how much I'd contributed to their household over 3 years. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries, medications, home repairs, insurance deductibles. The number was staggering. I'd essentially been paying rent on a house I would never inherit, funding a life I would never be considered worthy of sharing. The final insult was Halsey's follow-up call, ostensibly to check on my emotional well-being after the difficult revelation about the will. She wanted to discuss my financial rehabilitation plan, maybe set up some kind of structured support system to help me demonstrate the responsibility our parents had hoped to see. She offered to help me create a budget. Halsey, who was inheriting a house I'd been paying for, wanted to teach me how to manage money responsibly. The conversation ended with her expressing hope that we could maintain a close relationship despite the unfortunate circumstances, and her confidence that I would eventually understand our parents' difficult but loving decision to prioritize my personal growth over immediate gratification. I hung up the phone and transferred my final mortgage payment to their account. One last installment on a house that would never be mine, for people who died believing I was too irresponsible to deserve their legacy. Update. Original post got way more attention than I expected. Link in comments. So a lot of you asked what happened after I found out about the will, and honestly, the aftermath has been more educational than the betrayal itself. The first week after the will reading, I did something I'd never done in 3 years. I didn't transfer the mortgage payment. Not out of spite, exactly. More like I finally understood that I'd been paying rent on a relationship that had already evicted me. Hard to justify covering expenses for a house you'll never inherit, managed by people who considered you too irresponsible to deserve it. The missed payment triggered an automatic late notice, which arrived at Mom's house exactly 10 days later. She called me in a panic, crying about confusing bank statements and wondering what had happened to their assistance program. Dad had never explained the source of those monthly deposits, so she genuinely had no idea where they'd been coming from. I could have used that moment to reveal everything, could have explained that her mysterious financial stability had been funded by the daughter they'd deemed unworthy of inheritance, could have walked her through 3 years of bank statements, proving that my irresponsible spending habits had included a $2,800 monthly gift that kept her housed. Instead, I told her I'd heard about programs being discontinued due to budget cuts, suggested she might want to contact a financial advisor about managing the transition, recommended the same budgeting resources that Halsey had suggested for my rehabilitation. Halsey called 2 days later. She'd been fielding Mom's panicked voicemails about the mortgage situation and needed to understand what kind of crisis they were facing. Her voice had that familiar edge of someone who'd been designated to handle everything, but hadn't actually been handling anything. She asked if I knew anything about their monthly assistance payments, whether I'd heard Dad mention where that money had been coming from, if I had any insight into their actual financial situation now that she was responsible for managing everything. I gave her the same response I'd given Mom: budget cuts, discontinued programs, unfortunate timing. Maybe she should look into their complete financial picture now that she was the responsible party. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, smaller. She asked if I thought they'd been living beyond their means, if the house payment was something they could realistically manage on Mom's income alone, if I had any advice about how to approach the conversation about downsizing. Halsey, who'd spent 3 years building a case about my financial incompetence, was asking me for financial advice about assets she'd inherited by claiming I couldn't be trusted with money. I told her she should probably talk to a professional, someone qualified to handle complex financial situations, someone responsible enough to be trusted with important decisions. The foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks later. Mom called me sobbing, holding a legal document she couldn't understand, asking how this was possible when they'd been so careful about their finances. She kept mentioning how proud Dad had been that they'd managed to stay current on everything despite his reduced income, how he'd said they were blessed to have things work out so well. That's when I realized Dad had genuinely convinced himself that the mortgage money was coming from somewhere else. He'd created an entire mythology around their financial stability that didn't include accepting help from the daughter he'd disinherited for being financially unstable. The psychology of it was almost beautiful in its complexity. Halsey's inheritance was technically sufficient to pay off the remaining mortgage balance, but that would have required liquidating Dad's retirement accounts and most of their savings. The daughter who'd been deemed responsible enough to inherit everything was facing the choice between preserving her inheritance and preserving Mom's housing. She called me again, this time openly asking for help. Not money, she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge that level of irony, but advice about managing competing financial priorities. How do you balance immediate needs against long-term security? How do you make decisions when every option has serious consequences? I told her these sounded like exactly the kind of complex financial decisions that our parents had worried I wasn't mature enough to handle. Maybe she should consult with that financial counseling service Mr. Brennan had recommended for my rehabilitation. The solution Halsey eventually chose was elegantly appropriate. She convinced Mom to sell the house and move into a senior living community, positioning it as a positive transition toward more social engagement and professional care management. The house sale would cover the outstanding mortgage and provide enough cushion to fund Mom's new living situation for several years. Mom would lose the house I'd spent 3 years protecting, but she'd gain financial security from the daughter who'd inherited everything by proving she was the responsible one. Halsey handled the logistics beautifully, just like she'd handled Dad's funeral arrangements. Professional competence applied to cleaning up messes created by problems she'd helped engineer. The house sold within a month. Mom moved into a lovely assisted living facility that I visit every Tuesday and Thursday, bringing groceries she can't eat and listening to stories about the old neighborhood she misses. She mentions Halsey's weekend phone calls and occasional visits, always praising her for being such a thoughtful daughter who checks in regularly. I'm still the daughter who shows up, just like I always was. The difference is that now I'm the daughter who shows up to a rented room instead of a house I used to own in everything but name. Halsey sent me a card after the move was complete, thanking me for being so understanding about the difficult family circumstances and expressing hope that we could maintain a positive relationship moving forward. She included a gift card for the financial counseling service, just in case I wanted to take advantage of the resource during my rehabilitation period. The card is still sitting on my kitchen counter, unopened. Some gifts aren't worth the cost of accepting them. The strangest part of all this is how normal it feels now. I spent 3 years being the invisible foundation that held everything together, and now I'm the invisible presence that visits twice a week and handles the practical details that Halsey's phone calls can't address. The only real change is that I'm no longer paying for the privilege of being taken for granted. Mom asked me last week if I understood why Dad had made the will decisions he did. She said she'd been thinking about it, trying to make sense of how we'd gotten to this point, wondering if there were signs she'd missed about the family dynamics. I told her that parents usually know their children better than anyone, and that Dad's decisions probably reflected his genuine assessment of our respective capabilities. She looked confused, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Some puzzles aren't meant to be solved. Some family stories are written in invisible ink that only becomes visible when it's too late to rewrite the ending. I've stopped trying to make myself visible to people who needed me to be transparent to justify their choices. The invisible daughter finally learned that sometimes the best way to be seen is to stop insisting that you matter to people who've already decided you don't. Edit. To everyone asking if I'm going to tell Mom the truth, I've thought about it, but what would be the point? She's 73, grieving, and finally settled somewhere safe. Learning that her financial security came from the daughter who got disinherited for being irresponsible would just create guilt without changing anything meaningful. Edit 2. Yes. I know I could contest the will. My lawyer says I have grounds based on the documented evidence of my support. But legal vindication would cost more than inheritance money is worth, and I'd rather spend my energy building a life that doesn't depend on recognition from people who refuse to see me when it mattered. Sometimes walking away is the most expensive gift you can give yourself.